More than a third of black workers report being unfairly treated in the workplace due to their race and ethnicity, according to a survey released by the Society for Human Resource Management in May of 2021. The number rises to 42% over the last 5 years for black workers. The cost of racial injustice report found. The number of Asian workers who experienced discrimination at work stood at 26% over the same 5-year time span, while Latinos and Hispanics reported discrimination at a 21% clip, while white workers experienced the same at a rate of 12%. One man who's been on a mission to change the way we view racism in the workplace is Karol. For more than 10 years, he's fundamentally changed the viewpoints of senior leaders, executives, media, and government officials, along with the nonprofit sector and organizational teams, through leadership, coaching, speaking, and more. By facilitating reflective and actionable conversations about racism, he's literally helped thousands of people and dozens of organizations become more inclusive, self-aware, and anti-racist, while also becoming more empathetic. Karol joined me this week to have a conversation about racism, how to curb it in the workplace, his book on the topic, and so much more. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Jared, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program, and I'm super excited to talk to you about curbing the amount of racism in the world today, buddy. Good to see you this morning, and thank you so very much for being here.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Glad to have this conversation.
As am I. And Jared, tell me, I know that you've been on a mission for the last 10 years to really help organizations and government officials and those in nonprofits to really change their perspective about racism. So I'm wondering if you can tell me all about it, buddy, and the good work that you do.
Yeah, so it's been about 10 years. I was a teacher for 12 years, so I left in 2011, so about 11 years. Really been focusing on how do I, as a white man, with a lot of privilege, a lot of access, a lot of influence, opportunity, how do I use that power and that privilege to influence others who are in, really anyone, but especially people who are in positions of power and positions of decision making, who are, really making, whether they're in corporations or policy or politics, making decisions that are adversely affecting so many people, not just black folks, but all kinds of folks of color. But my father was a gay man, so I'm really invested and committed to equity and equality for the LGBT community, and really helping through dialogue, through conversation, through storytelling, through relationships, through listening, helping folks evolve their consciousness, accelerate their fluency around these issues that are affecting all of us, really, but especially folks who are on the downside of power.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sparked my interest to ask you a follow-up question since you shared about your father. We just had in the States the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and that could affect other rights to privacy laws as well. So are you worried about things like marriage equality and other rights to privacy and equity for groups around America with this decision?
Great question, Kevin. I am actually, and I think people should be. You know, the logic. Well, I mean, I think you know this as a black man. Anytime there's progress, whether it's racial progress, sexual orientation, anytime there's kind of, progress for any group of people or any kind of with any kind of dimension of diversity, there's always backlash. There's always some sort of response, some sort of reaction, some sort of backlash against that progress. And so I think what we're seeing now, right, is Roe v. Wade was 73. I was born in 73, so it's like it's my lifetime basically, right? And we think, hey, all right, that's great, that's progress. Well, we know it's taken 49 years, but it's not like it's just this year that people are upset about it, that people want to change it. So finally it's changed. And I think the same type of logic around not seeing it as an equity issue, not seeing it as an equality issue, but seeing it, people in power, whether they're white, whether they're straight, whether they're men, or all all of the above, see it as they are now being oppressed, being marginalized, being challenged, and I think many of us who understand that that's not true. That doesn't matter, because if people think that, that's what they're going to push forward with. And so if you have people in power, whether they're in media or politics or government, right, they're going to push that narrative. And there are enough people in the United States and around the world who share that belief, in that narrative, who are going to work very hard, are going to continue to work very hard to reverse some of the freedoms, some of the opportunities, some of the equality and equity that we have fought so hard for. And you brought up marriage equality. I've also heard people talking about reversing the right for interracial marriage, right? Things that we've just think like, yeah, it's about time we've gotten these, and now it's like, oh wait, those could be under threat. So I think the message is to be staying vigilant, to not accept anything that it's just going to be, not take anything for granted, because there are people who actively and aggressively want things reversed.
Yeah, and let's talk now about the book and the podcast that you've created to sort of address this issue. I know it's called Confronting Racism, an invitation to act, reflect, and act. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about it.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, it's called A White Guy Confronting Racism. So I am that white guy confronting racism. And, we'll talk about the title first and then the subtitle, because they're both very important. So I wanted something that was very, very clear and very unapologetic about who I am, right, as a white person, because I don't have to. This is the thing with white people, and when I work with white people in a variety of contexts around, like, we don't have to do this because racism benefits us, right? It serves us to be quiet, to go along with the status quo, to not buck the system, right? And so I'm saying, hey, but actually, when we really think about it, it doesn't serve us. It impacts us all. It infects us all. The mental bandwidth, the things we have to think about, impact us. Not in the same way as Black folks and other people of color, but it does impact us. So I'm saying, in the book, hey, let's really think about who we are. And the audience is mostly white folks, although it's anyone can read it. It's applicable to anyone, and can be understood and used by anyone. But it's really, hey, white folks, who are we and who do we want to be? Who do you want to be? Do you want to be that guy who doesn't care, who doesn't know, who isn't curious, who's clueless, etc.? Or do you want to be a guy or a person, right, who who cares about humanity, who understands that these issues of racism, whether they're personal, individual, and especially systemic and institutional, they affect us all. They affect us all. They affect you in your day-to-day work, your relationships, your navigating the world. And so it's really a call. It's part manifesto, part confessional. I tell a lot of stories about my evolution of consciousness, and part call to action. And that's where the invitation to reflect and act is. And it's very intentional, both reflection and action, because I think sometimes we jump straight to the action. Like, tell me what to do. All right, I'm going to go do this thing or these three things, or I'm going to go to that march or go to that meeting or whatever, which is great. Action is awesome and it's necessary, but without the ongoing reflection and really thinking about who we are and how we're showing up in our various contexts, sometimes the action can be limited, can be performative, and can be can not have the scale and the impact that we really want it to have. So that's why I emphasize the reflection, to really ongoingly be thinking about how this is all manifesting.
Yes, and I think if you're thankful for your act, you can be more effective when you act, right? If you reflect first, right? That's the entire point.
Exactly, and I don't see it necessarily. I mean, you said reflect first. Yes, reflect first, then act. But it's more of like an interweaving of reflection and action. So right, so something comes up. Let's just take like this whole idea of like critical race theory. That's being talked about in conservative circles, right? Like, okay, so an action might be like, well, that's messed up, and I'm going to go to this institution or this thing, and I'm going to drive for change, and you make some policy change, or you make some institutional change. Great, but as we talked about a little bit ago, like that's not the end of it. Sometimes I think people think you do an action, you've changed something, you can kind of just wipe your hands, and you're like, all right, I act, we're done, next. And we know it doesn't work that way. These issues, these perspectives, they're cyclical. They're contested ongoingly. So we have to continually be reflecting about, like, what do we need to, now I've acted in this context, what do I need to continually be reflecting on so that I can continually act in impactful and effective ways? So I think that's the message that I'm trying to get across to folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, Jared, I don't have to tell you that the American society is becoming increasingly more partisan. I'm always one for building bridges of acceptance and inclusion. So, from your perspective, tell me, how do you think we can create sort of more bridges of understanding and bridge that partisan divide?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Kevin. If I had the answer, we would be Nobel Peace Prize winners. But I think, and this is going to sound cliche, and I'll unpack a little bit, but we really have to listen to each other. I've been doing this work for 22 years, in some capacity. And I'd say for about, probably 12, 13 years, I was what I would call a social justice warrior. I was hard hitting, I was aggressive, I was acerbic, right? And I was really just trying to get my point across, and to anyone who would listen, and I wasn't really interested in the conversation. I was like, you're wrong, you don't get it, you don't understand why your action or your inaction is blah blah blah. And I was dogmatic, I was preachy, I was self-righteous. And I found that I wasn't really making the impact that I wanted to. Right? I might have looked good, and people might have given me applause or patted me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, thanks so much for your work." But in the end, was I really actually making change? Maybe some. So what I've found the last 10 years or so, really, and especially the last several years, as I really deepen my my understanding of how I need to be doing this work, is a couple of things that are important. One is EQ, emotional intelligence. So that involves, curiosity, it involves empathy, it involves compassion, it involves listening, humility, self-awareness, vulnerability, right? Being willing to stay in conversations when they're uncomfortable, when people disagree with you, when people are being rude or aggressive, right? So there's that EQ side of things. There's also the mindfulness side of things, right? How do we sit with uncertainty? If I come up and I say, hey, blah, 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 and someone says, I don't believe that. I don't believe, black people should have equal rights. I don't believe in gay marriage, right? If I'm going to go, well, you're wrong, it's never going to go anywhere. It's just going to fuel that divide that you were talking about a few minutes ago, Kevin. So how do we sit with that uncertainty, and how do we say, hey, tell me more about your perspective, right? Which sounds counterintuitive. Like you're gonna ask a racist or a homophobe or a right wing blah blah, like to tell you, yeah, I am. Because if we can disarm and decharge a little bit, we can actually have conversation, and that's where the understanding of perspectives can change. And then the third part, the third emphasis that I kind of put a lot of weight on is storytelling. How do we individually and collectively, people who care about equity, about justice, about change, how do we craft narratives that are inclusive, that are compelling, that are personal, that are vulnerable, right? And how do we shape those narratives that get out into the world and start to be the dominant narratives, as opposed to the current dominant narratives, which of course are going to uphold the privileged majority. So that's kind of an overview of my approach, right? EQ, mindfulness, and storytelling and narrative is really our key factors and components to my work, and I would say our work.
Yeah, it's a collective effort for sure. And, Jared, I'm also wondering your perspective on the Black experience in America as a Caucasian male and how it's really evolved. Obviously, one of the most prevalent headlines was the murder of George Floyd and the continual mass shootings in America. So when we look at the black experience from your perspective, what do you think of?
Yeah, great question, and thank you for trusting me by asking that and wanting to hear my answer. One thing I'm very clear about in the book and when I talk, is that as a white person, I'm very mindful and intentional about not speaking on behalf of anyone really, but especially on behalf of black folks or any individual black folk person or as a collective. So with that said, though, one thing that I have found to be successful for myself and very important, and that I try and help others, is I believe black people. I believe individual stories. I believe the collective experience. Who am I as a white person to doubt or challenge or disbelieve or dismiss when a black person says, this happened to me? This is how I feel. So I think that might seem like a no-brainer, but sadly, when we think about the divisiveness that you talked about earlier, the political divide, the challenging, it really comes down to white people not believing what black people are saying. So, I don't feel, if I'm a black person, I don't feel safe around the police. Well, I do. How come you don't? Right? Or I don't think, I think there's, I think there's inequality in my job. I don't see any black people, in the upper leadership. Well, that's just because they're not, qualified, right? So there are all these excuses, these responses that white people and other folks have that perpetuate the narrative that black people aren't good enough, aren't strong enough, aren't smart enough, all these things. And if we really, or when we really, as white folks, think about our responses, I bet that most of us don't really believe most of the things that we're saying. So I've kind of taken this default position is, if you say something is true, I believe you. It's true. And so with that perspective, when we get into these conversations about whatever it's police brutality or inequality or whatever the issues are, I'm in a better position to be part of that conversation because I already default believe you. And I think that's something that white folks can and should really work on to have better, more productive conversations that lead to more equity and equality.
Yeah, and a big part of the core of your work has to do with eradicating racism in the workplace. So talk to me about eradicating attitudinal barriers from leadership positions at work and how we sort of move that needle of progress forward.
Yeah, no, great. And this is the challenge because here's for every senior white leader, and they're mostly men, so let's just say for every senior, white man who's like, I don't believe that, and they're actively, oppositional and confrontational, right? Those, I mean, yes, you do have those guys, and they need to be talked to, but those are hard nuts to crack. But what I'm really interested are the white folks who are in senior positions who aren't oppositional. They're not necessarily confrontational, but they're not actually actively doing anything, right? So they're not like, no, I don't believe this. Like, oh yeah, great, yep, 100% agree, Jared. Yep, yeah, we need to do more, right? So they're in agreement. They're saying the right things, but are they actually taking action? So my approach is to be, people are probably familiar with like the yin yang kind of concept, right? Like this idea of complementary forces. So you have like, for when there's night, there needs to be day. When there's light, there's darkness, right? And so the same idea I take with this idea of like, I'm going to challenge you to think differently, to take action, to go outside of your comfort zone, to use your power and privilege to make change. And this is the key part, which I think a lot of coaches and consultants don't focus. I'm also going to support you in doing that work. Because if you think about it, if I've never thought about really in any real sense about racism, about inequality, about injustice, right? And I'm the leader of this, big company, and then someone like me comes in and says, hey, I'm going to help you. And I just say, hey, here's equity, here's such justice, here's what you got to do, now go do it. They're not going to be able to do that. They're not. They're just not. They don't have the fluency, they don't have the motivation, they don't have the background, they don't have the time. So when we challenge people, we have to kind of have that support. And support doesn't mean hand-holding, it doesn't mean coddling. It means, all right, we've talked about what needs to be done. I'm going to be here with you to support you in doing that. I'm going to keep reminding you. I'm going to give you resources. I'm going to give you support. I'm going to be a thought partner for you. So all these things are part of it. Now, as a white person, right, I feel comfortable being in that role with other white folks because they can come to me and, I'm white like them, but I've also done enough work, enough learning and growing to have a different perspective that can support them in their growth and journey where they actually start to make change and make better decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jared, I'll share just a bit about myself. I was born with cerebral palsy, Bonnie, and outside of hosting this podcast, I work with organizations to sort of level the playing field for folks with disabilities when it comes to employment. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on the notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce for folks with disabilities as well.
Yeah, so that hasn't been my focus in my work, but the way I look at it is, there's what we have is, what we call in the field kind of like a dominant narrative. So the dominant narrative is whether it's white supremacy, it's male, it's patriarchy, it's heteronormativity, and then it's able-bodied, right? It's people who are able-bodied who don't have a disability, don't identify with having disability, and what happens is whatever that dimension of diversity, right? All these different dimensions of diversity, folks who are part of the dominant narrative think that their norm is the norm. And so I'm sure you've experienced this in your career, Kevin, and just in your life, right? Like, how do we transform from, oh, we have to tolerate this, or we have to do something different to accommodate? How do we work in all people's abilities into the dominant narrative, into the norm, where it's not like an other thing. It's not an extra thing. It's not, this tedious thing. It's like, this is what we do. And so, again, that's not my kind of specialty, my area of expertise, but it's the same philosophy, right? How do we normalize everyone's experience so that people aren't feeling outed and shamed and otherized for who they are? And so that's, obviously that's super high level kind of perspective, but that's the philosophy or the ethos that I think more of us need to be taking when we're creating policies, when we're, regulations, laws, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Jared, I also wanted to ask you about political inaction in Congress when it comes to, guns. I live here in Canada. I live in Ontario, where once the shootings in the States happened, our Prime Minister over here outlawed AR-15s for recreational use. But in America, they're somewhat beholden to the NRA, and they don't want the business model of that to be disrupted. But my counterpoint to that would be, how many people have to die before they actually do something about gun violence? I know that they recently passed that bipartisan gun bill, but I'm curious, as a white male, how do you view the continued mass shootings in America and how we curb the bloodshed?
Yeah, great perspective. I love how you frame that, Kevin. Oh man, it's it's something that I worry about. I have 13-year-old twins. I live in Oakland, which is a big city in the Bay Area. There's a lot of gun violence in my hometown. You know, I think people are so I don't know if it's addicted or just strongly attached or what it is to the idea that guns are necessary. From the Second Amendment in America's Constitution, you have the right to bear arms, and the context in which that amendment was passed or was 200 and plus 250 years ago is different now. It's just different, and so you mentioned the NRA, conservatives, gun owners, right? They're so they're prioritizing that right to own, to have a gun over the reality of what's happening and what's been happening for years, decades, and it's tough, Kevin. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't. If I'm just being candid, I don't see a breakthrough anytime soon. I don't know this. I haven't read the specifics of the new bipartisan law that you mentioned, but I think it's going to be tough because if I'm prioritizing gun rights over mass shootings, what else is going to convince me to change the laws, to change the ability for people to get guns? I don't know, and I wish I had a stronger, more clear answer, but I don't.
Yeah, there's also a correlation between racism and voting rights. And as you know, Jared, there's a big midterm election coming up in November, and there are certain states around the country that are actively trying to restrict access to the voter box. So how concerned are you from the lens of racism about the restricted or proposed restricted access to the ballot box?
Yeah, I'm very concerned, Kevin. And here's the whole thing: whether it's politicians or government officials or key media personalities, someone like a Tucker Carlson, right? There's this idea of replacement theory, and there are all kinds of versions of it and extremes of it. But the basic idea is that, oh no, white people And in this, yes, just keep it to race. In this case, white people who have been, we've been the dominant group for, since the founding of this country, of America and before. Now we are under attack. We are the victims. If we don't stand up for us and all these beliefs and these traditions and these values, then we're going to be replaced. We're going to go away. And so that theory, whether it's extreme overt racism or more kind of covert kind of dog whistle stuff, that's what's driving these policies, these voting regulation changes, the rhetoric is they, and they meaning black folks, meaning immigrants, meaning, whoever, right? They are coming to replace us. And if we don't do something about it, we're screwed. And I think that message, and it's hard to know, like, do people really believe that? Or are they just pushing that to, for political gains? I think it's both. I think I think there's a spectrum, there's a continuum of folks. And so that's what we're dealing with, right? This inability for white folks who have been in power and still are, by the way, in power, this concern that they will not be in power soon. And so these political and rhetorical moves over the last, well, really several decades to, well, we need to make sure, look, we all know that the 2020, voting thing was a scam, right? There was no illegal vote. There's no illegal ballots, right? But pushing that agenda supports this whole idea of like, we need to stand up for our democracy. And it's like, that's what we're dealing with. So people who are on the left, unfortunately have to counter that, have to come up with strategies around how do we fight this? How do we disabuse people who are inclined to follow that rhetoric when it's illogical and not true?
And yeah, when we talk about the political consequences of all of this, we're seeing it in the Supreme Court. One of the legacies of former President Trump would be stacking the court with three Supreme Court justices that were determined to be more conservative and sort of walk back the progress that has been made. So when we look at politically at the Supreme Court and racism, how do you think those things are interconnected?
Oh, I mean, I would say Trump and these three justices and just other policies and rhetoric and kind of dominant political discourse has reinforced the racism that has been here for forever. So it's not like it's, we were fine with Obama and now Trump's brought it back. Like he's brought it back, but I think that's the wrong way to look at it. He hasn't brought it back. He's just kind of highlighted what's been going on for centuries, and with more vigor, with more specificity, with more callousness, with more candor, right? And so when you have someone like him and people who support him, and then have the power to appoint, through part luck of the draw, but to appoint three conservative justices, I mean, that's going to have implications for us for decades, right? And it's frightening. And I think of, and this is going to sound, maybe cliche, but I just think of my kids. They're 13, and what's their life going to be like in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? Are we going to live in this racist dystopia, or will the seeds of change and shifting demographics, will they shift, what the world's like? I don't know. And that's why we continue to do the work, because each one of us has to be influential in shaping the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And The final question I have for you on racism before I ask you about your interest in hobbies is the role the media plays. Jared, I originally went to school to become a journalist, and I have to tell you, I'm somewhat disappointed in the role the media has played in sort of shaping the narrative. So tell me, how do you view the role of the media in this whole discussion?
Well, yeah, I mean that's a big topic, Kevin. But I think generally, like most media is sensationalized, right? It's to get it's to get readers or viewers or whatever the medium is, and I think there are outlets out there who do go deeper and who do kind of really have the conversations, and that's important. And but they're also, and this is both on the left and the right and everywhere in between, right? That just looking to sensationalize and do sound bites, and that's nothing new, right? That's how media works. And so my suggestion and my invitation and my challenge to people is, find media outlets that aren't just parroting, the same things that others are saying, right? Be willing, be curious, be interested in more nuanced perspectives, be willing to read maybe a longer article or watch a different video from a source maybe that isn't as mainstream. So it's really around how does each of us kind of curate, if you will, our our media consumption, because unless we're going to just avoid it altogether, which some would argue is a good choice, right? Unless we're going to do that, like we're going to be bombarded by it. So how do we ensure as best we can that what we are consuming gives us the most thorough analysis and perspectives on the issues that we can make the most informed decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jared, doing my research on you, buddy, I know that you're an avid reader and musician. So tell me, when you're not doing this important work, how do you sort of find your inner center and reconnect with what really makes you passionate outside of work?
Yeah, no, absolutely avid reader. I just started my 60th book of the year, so I'm on track to read more than 100 books this year. I read all kinds of stuff, fiction. I read a lot of music biographies, a lot of stuff on history. So yeah, reading. A lot of people see reading as like a task. I see it as a way to just relax and enter into other worlds. I'm also a big meditator, so I'll meditate at least 10 minutes a day, usually more, just to kind of calm myself, center myself, be ready for the world. I'm also, as you said, a musician. I play in a reggae band. So I'm a guitarist and a little bit of harmonica. I used to play some bass in a reggae band. And then my son and we've been really kind of getting into record collecting the last like six months or so. Listen to some jazz. He's a piano player, so listen to a lot of jazz and kind of African stuff, world music. And there's a lot of good record stores around, in Oakland and San Francisco that we frequent. So yeah, I definitely prioritize self-care and a break from my work and from the 9 to 5, because if not, it'll just eat you up. So yeah,
It's important, isn't it?
it so is, Kevin. It so is. Yes, for sure.
Yeah, and Jared, when you look at your overall legacy, both personally and professionally, buddy, I'm wondering how do you want that to be defined?
I want people to see me as someone who cared about humanity, who was willing to listen to people, who was curious, who had something to say, who contributed to the conversation, the important conversations around justice, around equity, who who was always willing and able to show up and advocate for people who maybe didn't have as strong a voice, or whose voices were seen as less than or diminished. And so part of that also, and this is where the mindfulness comes in, Kevin, is you know not I'm not attached to, I'm invested in, but I'm not attached to outcomes. And I think that equanimity is really important to me, both now and as a legacy, to say, all right, he was able to do this work for, who knows what it will have been, 40, 50 years, but he never burned out. He never, he was just consistent. And I think that equanimity is a big part of that legacy, to be able to do this work for the long haul.
Consistency of performance is important, isn't it?
That's so right, Kevin. Yes.
Absolutely. So, Jared, tell me if people want to get connected with you personally, or they want that to do better. What's the best way they can do that?
Yeah, so I'd say three main ways. One is LinkedIn. So I'm pretty active, although not as much as I was the last couple of years, but on LinkedIn. So just search for me, Jared Karol, Jared Karol. On LinkedIn, you can connect with me or send me a message. Also, my website, jaredkarol.com, is where you can find out about my services, coaching and speaking and facilitating conversations. And then the book, you can also find there at jaredkarol.com, but also a White Guy Confronting Racism.com/book. And that's where you can learn more about the book and find all kinds of different places to buy it, including several Black-owned bookstores, which I'm trying to do my best to support. So those are the three main areas. I'm not on a lot of other social media that actively, so those are your best bets.
Well, sometimes, being detached from social media isn't a bad thing, right?
I wholeheartedly agree.
Absolutely. Well, Jared, I want to thank you for engaging in conversation with me this morning and providing your perspective on a very important topic of confronting racism. Buddy, your interesting perspective and time on my behalf is most appreciated, and I want to thank you for being here this morning.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. You're very welcome. I'm glad to be here with you and have had this conversation.